Welcome to Insight Out, an NOV podcast uniquely featuring a mix of energy, business, and leadership. My name is Assaad Mohanna. I'm the Director of Business Strategy here at NOV, and I am glad you are joining us today. With oil prices sitting at over $60 and a continued recovery of the North American rig count and international activity, things are starting to look a little better than what's behind us. But that doesn't mean we are entirely out of the ditch. So a little bit more on that once we welcome our guest. Some of you may have noticed we're playing around with the format of the show, and we're trying a new style and structure, trying to make it a little bit more compact, a bit more engaging, and a little bit more about our guests. So bear with us as we tweak around, and always welcome your feedback to make this better. Today, we're celebrating the 50th episode of the show. We're also celebrating St. Patrick's Day, but also the 50th episode of the show, which is a huge milestone for Insight Out, for what was Ask Assaad, and for the team behind this show. I want to say that I remember back in March in 2020 when we first kicked this off as an internal NOV show. We had at most a few dozen viewers back then, but today we're proud to offer a much more comprehensive, after a pretty steep curve, a much more comprehensive offering with thousands of viewers from around the world, and a unique podcast that shares insight from NOV as well as from business leaders, academics, and analysts. Today, we get to celebrate the 50th episode with someone who has great perspective and insight on our industry and on the energy transition. Joining us from Oslo in Norway, the CEO of Rystad Energy, Jarand Rystad. Jarand, if you're there,
yeah,
right there. Welcome to the show, Jarand.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Yeah, great to be here. Congratulations with the 50th episode.
Thank you, and it's great to celebrate that with you. Let me start with maybe an easy one. Do you think we found our way out of the crisis?
I think long term we will come out of it due to the vaccination program. But sometimes it's 2 or 3 steps ahead and 1 or 2 steps back. And I think the recent development of the AstraZeneca vaccination is, of course, a setback, that we see these fatalities and these problems with in the blood. So the latest research I've heard about that this morning was that they think it's a link. I haven't seen that confirmed with the official, but still that is one of the setbacks. But still, long term we will come back, but it will take another 12 to 24 months until we will see normalization, I think, globally.
Right. Yeah, it's devastating news to see the process with that vaccine. But I think the process in the last 6 months has been kind of flipping things over. It seems like at least people are starting to get in their cars and drive to work in some places around the world. Getting on airplanes is becoming a little bit more acceptable.
It is, but it's really a race now between the vaccination and this new mutation of the virus.
Right.
So, for example, in Norway, we have all-time high of contamination cases today.
Wow.
And this is due to the new virus. So the previous lockdown measures was sufficient to keep the old virus down, but not the new one. Mm-hmm. And I think quite some countries will go through this now. But at the same time, the fatality rate is going down since the elderly population is vaccinated. So it's really a race now between these two. And I think we have to live with quite strict lockdowns for at least 2-3 months more.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And we're seeing that on the business side too. Companies are hopeful, I think, referring to the latest earnings call. Companies are hopeful for the second half of the year, but not so much for the first half.
I think so, yeah.
Jarand, and as if COVID wasn't enough, Texas went through a big freeze not too long ago. You guys in Norway are used to it, but the Texas and Colorado or Oklahoma infrastructure are not used to such temperatures. We saw a lot of finger pointing on whose fault it was and who wasn't ready and who can be the more reliable source of energy. Can we expect an accelerated energy transition because of what's happening?
Yeah, I think that will be the effect of it. It was actually finger pointing. People said, oh, look at the solar panels. They are filled with snow. They will not help us. Look at the breakdown of some of the wind farms. That will not help us. But actually looking at each of the power producing plants, a lot of the issues was also with a kind of traditional fossil fuel plant, and especially with the grid. So I think the entire energy system collapsed, and many of the solutions is actually linked to what I will see as the new energy grid opportunities, which is including a lot of batteries also to not only stabilize the grid from a frequency point of view, but also to back up, in situations like this. And these discussions has evolved a lot since this event, and I think this is one of the things that will be improved following this snow. What did you call it? Snow it.
Yeah. I think it's Storm Uri. I like that you mentioned it's an opportunity, and that's how we've been seeing it. This is an opportunity to do a lot of things, and that's contribute to a better energy mix, to reduce carbon emissions, to improve on the workforce and the diversification. What we don't hear so much about is how we measure the transition. Do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, I think you can do that in many ways. I mean, the most leading indicator is to look at the share price of the energy transition companies. It's very leading, and it's already been through a boom and into a kind of bust. And I think maybe some of this was a bubble, as we saw the internet bubble 20 years ago, etc. The next indicator will be the share of investments in renewables and batteries and hydrogen versus the share of investments in traditional fossil fuel-based energy systems. And this is where we will see it the first with the kind of solid economic figures. So, for example, BP, that has an ambition to go for 50 gigawatt in 2030 of renewables, they have then to allocate half of their investments over the next decade into renewables. Right. The next step then will be to look at actual production. And still then I think that is a more lagging indicator. Still it's very dominant. I mean, still renewables in total is 9% of the power production. And it's less than 3% of the global energy consumption. Right. And the least, the indicator that is coming in the end is the carbon, the carbon dioxide parts per million in the atmosphere, which has increased, as we know, to 420 approximately now, and that will be the most lagging indicator for how the energy transition is happening. And we have to look at all of these indicators. Yeah,
it's a combination of things, and it's probably individualized at the industry level, at the company level. Everybody has to find a way to measure it too, right?
Yeah, but you can look at the global investments also, and just now we actually see that in many geographies already investments in renewables are bigger than investments in fossil fuel.
Why is that?
Well, because it's very competitive. The issues with the renewables that has been cost, space, and intermittency is going to be solved, and it will be competitive. So that's why, and of course driven by policies, driven by the climate ambitions. So companies want to invest in it, and that's why we see this is happening.
Sure. Yeah, you mentioned policies, and that is the main driver. I think when we talk about policies, you can't but mention subsidies as well.
I think policies has been an important driver over the last 2 decades to mature many of these renewable technologies. And the policies is driven by the climate ambition. But I think now it's a kind of the inertia, it's got the momentum in itself is so strong that I think actually the energy transition now is going to happen almost regardless of policies and even the climate ambition. Because from now on and going forward, I think many of these new technologies are competitive like for like with the existing technologies, and they will win. But the policies will contribute to further speed it up. So whether we talk about the net zero by 2050 or 2065, I think policies will be a part of that. But that we will, for example, that the EVs, electric vehicles will take over, I think is going to happen in any case, because simply it's a much more economic and better technology.
I want to talk to you about the challenges with renewables, but before we get there, still a little bit on the funds. We talked about the migration of funds away from fossil fuels and potentially exceeding funds in renewables. But if we take a look at what the oil industry has gone through and how energy companies have adapted to the new normal, the way what COVID has done in restructuring and changing spending behavior and cutting costs and becoming these lean companies. We're also seeing a lot of companies emerge back from bankruptcy, which means less debt to service and more efficient companies. Is that enough to lure or to entice capital back in?
You mean back into the renewable industry or to the energy industry as a whole, or the fossil fuel?
Back to fossil fuel, back to energy companies that have really reinvented themselves and now are a lot leaner, a lot more profitable, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that first of all, I think in shale we will never see the same reinvestment rates that we have seen historically. That has been above 100%. So it has been basically needing more capital every year. So I think that will not happen. I think they will maybe reinvest 50, 60 or 70%, but the shareholders will require to pay back some dividend and some repayment of loan and all of that. But we see, for example, for offshore projects, in 2020 it was expected to be $220 billion committed in new greenfield project, and less than 50 were actually committed. So I think that, but these projects will come back. Many of these projects are still very competitive, and we will need them even in an energy transition kind of scenario. So the capital is coming back, most from the cash flow from the companies, and it's actually a record high cash flow from the E&P companies in 2021. It's likely to be a record high cash flow. So they have the cash to reinvest also, but less borrowing, and I think it will be a net payback to the bondholders, for example.
So there must be a role fossil fuel plays in a lower carbon future. I mean, we know you talked about net zero. Big oil is redirecting. Some companies are changing names. Some companies are entirely reinventing themselves. Where do we see that in the long term, in the overall message of lower carbon emission?
Yeah, of course, fossil fuel is 85% of the energy system today, so it's not going to change overnight. But I'm quite convinced that within 3 to 4 decades, it will be turned around. From 85 to maybe 15% of the energy mix in total, and this is possible actually. So, but it's some different scenarios, and that depends on how competitive CCS will be. But I think carbon capture and storage, with a very efficient and inexpensive carbon capture and storage, you could see that steel, coal, or gas could have some role to play in power production, for example, even in a zero carbon system. But most likely they will be totally removed from power production because renewables backed up by batteries and some other storage technologies will be more competitive, will be more convenient, more easy to use, etc. So you will only have the hydrocarbons back in kind of parts of the petrochemical industry. Both shipping and aviation could use hydrogen, for example.
Right.
The road traffic can be completely converted to batteries.
Yep.
Some think hydrogen, but I think rather batteries. So so it will be a gradual. It will flatten out in the 2020s. It will be a quite steep decline, I think, in the 2030s, even steeper in the 2040s, and then flattening out at a quite low level in the 50s and 60s.
Can I make an observation, Jarand? I think what I'm hearing is there's a long time span involved here, and that it's not a one size fit all. There's different approaches for different geographies and different markets, and that's going to take time. It's going to take time for adaptation to happen, but we're, like you said, it's at least 2 decades all the way up to 3 or 4 decades.
Yeah, absolutely. So and then of course then you have a discussion, could some regions be leading and influence the other regions? Okay. And clearly Europe is leading now, and they are having this discussion on a climate toll, a climate custom, that you have to pay for the carbon emissions associated to products that you are selling to Europe if you didn't have a kind of a green energy when you produced these products. So this could influence, the global production system, despite this regionalization that you are referring to. But I mean, some geographies, like especially India, they still have an ambition to ramp up coal production substantially going forward. Yeah. And we know that coal is a double problem. One is, of course, the well-known CO2 emissions related to coal power production. But what is less known, but the recent research shows actually much worse, is the methane emissions from coal mines. That is much bigger than previously anticipated. Right. And this is some kind of ambition from India to become independent of foreign coal. So they are really supporting it, almost subsidizing it. So this is just showing that, yes, some nations have a different plan. Even if they also have very strong ambitions on the renewable side, they have this very explicit strategy to also develop local coal mines, and I think this is one example that it will take time, and some nations are not necessarily following kind of the ambitions, for example, Europe have.
Yeah, great example on India, and very timely. I think that lately in the news, India has been putting pressure on Saudi Arabia to not cut production as much because they need to ramp up, and they're not, or they're so dependent on that supply. My question to you, Jarand, is there some sort of exclusivity in renewables to OECD, or maybe turn the question around, how do you give non-OECD countries access to this lower carbon emission energy?
Well, first of all, renewables is well suited to be implemented in most countries, even if you have different kind of energy intensities from the sun and the wind in the different parts of the world. Many of the best places is, of course, not OECD. So actually, in different from fossil fuel, where the energy sources are concentrated to a few countries, like 20 countries, renewables could be, and also that in fossil fuel, that this is the geopolitical kind of source of geopolitical power to have the energy dominance. Renewables is in one way more democratic. It can be used almost all over the world, So even if you have different kind of ideal places, like the best place for solar PV is mountain deserts like you have in Chile. But all, I mean, China, India, most of these places have excellent conditions. Maybe not some of the really tropical countries with a lot of very little wind at the equator and a lot of rain, tropical rain. That's maybe not so well suited, but still they can also actually develop some renewable resources. So it's all over. They can apply these technologies.
Yeah, it goes back to the energy transition is not a one-size-fits-all. It is a customized approach for every geography.
It is, yeah.
You mentioned intermittency. That's one of the challenges that renewables face. What else do you see?
Space use is the other challenge. Yeah. So I think we have reached the maturity for, the acceptance level, for example, for onshore wind turbines in Europe. We don't want to see them anymore. We don't want them to destroy the local wildlife, etc. So clearly, and if you look at if the world should be 100% wind and solar based in 2050, 2060, you need 5 million square kilometers of wind farms and 300,000 square kilometers of solar panels. That is actually quite much, but it is a solution to this also. And you may ask, what is the solution?
That's really what I'm waiting for.
So the solution for wind is offshore. You have to go offshore, and it's many basins well prepared for offshore wind, and they can be even bigger. It's some scale advantages to do that offshore. And also you have some remote places that you can also is well suited for onshore wind, but you can manage actually without big development onshore. On solar, you have several options. One is hydropower reservoirs. So that's very well suited. You are cooling down the panels, which is increasing the efficiency. You're reducing the evaporation for the hydropower reservoirs, and you can, and it's very cheap, and you already have the electricity infrastructure in place. So every place you have hydropower, you can also expand this with a solar PV. But also on agricultural land. Sometimes, many places you have too much agricultural land, and with a solar panel, you will have approximately $2 to $2.5 million per square kilometer in power revenue, while for crops, typically for wheat, for example, you have $60,000 per square kilometer. So for farmers, it's actually many places better use of acreage to use it for solar panels. In some cases, you can combine it also with the cattle, etc. But still, but I think you should have strict restrictions to not build any solar panel in wild nature, because that could be a very negative impact on biodiversity. So we don't want that. The third option is in general offshore. In addition to lakes, it could also be offshore solar panels. Yeah. And you have seen quite some technology development that recently with floating solar panels that can resist the heavy waves, storms, everything, and they are still very productive. So I think it is actually acreage available for renewables.
It's interesting. That's great insight. Appreciate you sharing that, Jarand. Clearly, lots of thought went into that. True challenges face renewables, and you're right. The space issue is going to be a limiter. And thinking of, and I think if I'm hearing this right, it's leveraging other spaces that are already taken to place these wind turbines and solar panels, so that we
building companies is of course also for solar panels, rooftops and integrated in new buildings is also one option, of course.
Oh, great. And you talked about offshore, and I'm very interested on that. NOV is doing quite a bit in the offshore space when it comes to wind tower installation vessels, as well as floating wind. What's the limitation there? And with floating wind in particular, where we're heading with that?
I mean, so far it's been quite costly. It's been 6-7 billion per gigawatt or million per megawatt dollars, which is which is twice what we see for bottom fixed, and it's 4 times what we see for solar. But the cost is coming down quickly, and the scalability could be even bigger for floating, because you don't need to adapt it to every kind of bottom situation. You can only moor it. So that could be more scalable, and it could be even bigger equipment also. So, but it's of course less mature. But we see some big projects now coming up, and I think that within 10 years it will come down in cost sufficiently to be competitive. And it's very complementary, you know, with offshore or with wind, with solar, for example. So you need both. That it's actually the system effect of having both solar and wind is reducing the total system cost quite much.
Okay. For those who have just joined us, we are talking with Jarand Rystad, CEO at Rystad Energy. For our audience, if you have any questions, this is your opportunity to ask Jarand live. Jarand, a couple more questions for you from me. And you touched on hydrogen. There's no shortage of news these days about hydrogen consortiums and projects and financing, etc. How do you separate the hype from an actual opportunity?
Yeah, actually, we just published a report publicly available also. So just go to our website and you can get this report on hydrogen. And I think we have a moderate view on this, meaning that that we see a great potential, but we don't see a kind of that it will be the full hydrogen society. We actually think that batteries will be even more competitive, especially for grid storage. So, but back in the 1970s, this term hydrogen society was invented, indicating that, you know, in the future, sometimes in the future, everything could go through hydrogen, and you can take the electricity back from hydrogen. But on that last topic, you know, that to have stranded electrons to make liquid or to make hydrogen, and then to take that back to power, that then you are losing 60% of the energy, and that is not going to be competitive with batteries. So for grid storage, I think that it will more be a battery society than a hydrogen society. But for steel applications, to make zero emission steel, it's absolutely hydrogen and green hydrogen. Of course, for fertilizer production, you can use it. For aviation, it's a very good prospect, because the lifting weight is very important in aviation, and you're actually using half of the energy in an airplane just to lift the fuel of the airplane. And if you have 3 times higher energy density per kilo in hydrogen. So that is absolutely a prospect, and you can make distributed hydrogen production nearby the airports. So I don't believe in a global commodity market for hydrogen. We are trading hydrogen across the continents because it's too expensive. It's not very convenient to move around. You know, we have to cool it down to extreme temperatures, but you can produce it locally. So it will be produced and alive in either big petrochemical hubs and close to to applications like I mentioned for aviation and airports. So this is the future I see. So niche applications in transportation and in especially marine and aviation, and in steel production, fertilizers, other petrochemicals, etc. And this could still lead to a 5-fold increase of the current hydrogen consumption. And it could be, in the long term, it could be green, produced from electrolyzer only. Shorter term, it could be blue also, you know, with the carbon capture based from methane, from natural gas.
Yeah, SMR. Yeah, great insight. Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely some challenges all around, but as the industry progresses and we find our way into making these sources of energy cheaper, I think we'll see more and more adoption. I want to pick up on what you mentioned about EV becoming the more reliable source. You must have also, in the realm of offshore, kept an eye on Deepsea Mining.
Yeah.
Where is that on the heat map for energy?
Yeah. We actually also just did a report on that, and
you got to report on everything.
Not to talk too much about Norway either, but actually it's two countries in the world that have access as a part of their economic zone, and the Atlantic Ridge with deep sea minerals in extremely high concentrations, and that's actually Fiji and it's Norway. And Norway has this island called Jan Mayen, and that is going on the Atlantic volcanic zone, opening of the Atlantic through Svalbard. And in where the Atlantic is opening or a continental plate is opening, you get big cracks. The water is going deep down into there, and at extreme temperatures, they will take in a lot of metals. And when they meet the cold water again, these metals will be placed, on the seafloor in where you have these cracks. And this is the case. And here you can have concentrations of copper up to 20%. And you can have, other attractive, very high concentration of minerals.
Yep.
So this is absolutely a new area that could be very competitive places to do mining. Average copper concentration for existing mines is 0.2% or something, I think. Okay. And this could be 20%, so 100 times higher concentration.
Right.
So this is one prospect for deep sea mining. The other is modules. That mangan kind of balls on the very deep sea, for example, in the Pacific Ocean.
Yep.
Also big prospects for that. But that has more environmental issues, so you have to look at holistic view on the potential environmental impact there as well.
That's right. Yeah, the corals impact as you pick up those polymetallic nodules from the seabed.
Exactly.
But definitely an interesting space that is gaining a bit more traction. I would love to keep going with my questions because I know I have a lot for you, Jarand. But I want to give a chance for the audience to share some of theirs. I want to bring up Shelby Dumaine, our social media expert. Shelby, welcome to the show. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well, Assaad, and good to see you, Jarand. Or Jarand, sorry. So we do have one question from Tamir on LinkedIn, and he mentioned that Norway, among I think a lot of countries, have a good percentage of renewables and hydropower, different energy in that space entering the market, but the oil and gas space still makes up about 50% of a lot of these countries, or maybe more than half of a lot of these countries' income still. And so he was wondering, do you believe that a painless transition to renewables is possible? And if so, what do you think is going to be the main challenge to overcome any potential pains?
Yeah, I think it will be some pain. And I think governments will need to look not for too high tax income. For one, oil and gas has been the source of super profit and basically run by governments to take out really super profit from this industry. Renewables will not offer the same opportunities. So governments have to find other ways to get the national budget in balance over time. But it will be good cash flow. Short term, for the next 2 decades, I think excellent cash flow because you will be investing less and you will still be harvesting quite much. But oil and gas nations, many of them have good oil service capabilities, vessels or technologies that could also be relevant in the renewable space. And they could have an energy market understanding that could also be relevant. So we could have capabilities that could be transferred. But also it will be a redistribution of kind of political and economic power in the world as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so this next one comes from Peter on LinkedIn, and he was wondering, this might be maybe a slightly more specific question than the first, but he was wondering, does the MENA, which is Middle East and North Africa region, have space limitations for wind and solar, in your opinion?
Yeah, of course, you could. The short answer is yes. Then the complication is that actually deserts are not the best place, surprisingly, for solar often, because it's too hot. So you get on the efficiency on the solar panels, and also it's too much dust many places. So you have to clean the panels, and that is increasing the operational cost. So it's not straightforward, but it is. So we have to deal with some issues, but still there's a lot of opportunities in the Middle East, both for wind and solar resources, if you are doing it in the right manner.
Excellent. Yeah. Shelby may have had that last question there. I want to follow up on that. You bring up a good point. Deserts are not the perfect place because of the dust and the maintenance and the access.
Yeah. Mountain deserts can be mountain deserts, like in Chile I mentioned. That could be very good if they're consolidated soil and high altitude.
Yeah. I want to, Jarand, I know you've appeared in some OPEC and OPEC Plus meetings and other high-level discussions. What options does OPEC Plus have in the energy transition as a whole?
Yeah, well, they have, as I said, they have 20 years with good cash flow, so still they can use that for quite some reorientation of their economy. But they have to start to think about it. But some of them are, integrating downstream into chemicals, etc. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Some of them are, looking at the technologies they have that you can use in renewables. For example, even geothermal wells could be an option if you have good drilling capabilities, etc. So I think, but you have to look into each of these countries, and they will have a different way. But it should be possible if you are quite well off, in a way, to think a little bit long term and to make a plan and to stimulate the local business life to look at the opportunity represented in the energy transition rather than only the threat.
Jarand, I think this was a fabulous discussion and conversation. Thank you for sharing all your insight with us.
Thank you. Very nice to be here.
To our audience, thank you for joining us on our 50th episode of I can't get enough of that. I'm really enjoying the fact that it is our 50th show. Thank you for being with us today with our special guest, Jarand Rystad, CEO at Rystad Energy. We are glad you joined us, and we look forward to seeing you at the same time next week. I wish you all a good day.